When someone pictures a rural county like Joe Daviess in the 1800s, they do not often imagine it to have a very well-educated population. However, most rural schoolhouses were built in the late 1840s, giving many children in the area an opportunity for public education.
Acquiring an education is very common in our society and often takes up a good portion of our lives. Today, people go through elementary school, middle school, high school, and perhaps even college. But back then, public schools were only just beginning for rural areas. Joe Daviess County acquired 118 rural schoolhouses, of which mostly all had only one room. They were used to give the rural population a better education for the future. Although there are many similarities between schools now and then, there are many more differences. The first rural schoolhouse of Joe Daviess County was built in Galena in 1827. Many more followed in the 1840s. After that, more small schoolhouses started to be built everywhere. Schools were each made of a material, such as log, rock, frame, or brick. Most only held about 5 to 30 students, depending on how many children lived within a 1-mile radius from the building.
Margaret shares with us how many students were in her class.
At the Drinda School, there was most of the time 5 or 6. But when I went to the Logan School, then I think I was the only one, like in 8th grade, and that there were only like 5 children in the whole school.
Preschool and kindergarten did not exist back then. This allowed kids to start in 1st grade, and from there, the same teacher usually taught up to 8th grade. The amount of children in each separate grade varied. However, it was usually very few, and under some circumstances, none.
When we were in the lower grades, we had to come up front and we sat around a little table with our reading books, and our teacher would have us read back to her, and but it was all done, even though there were other students in higher grades that were doing their homework and studying. We had to do it in a quiet manner so that we didn't, interrupt them in their studies. So, and it just worked for some reason. It's amazing how it did work.
Although all grades were in the same room, the younger children sat towards the front, whereas the older students sat in the back. Older grades would often help the younger ones to do schoolwork and to learn various lessons. The average school day, similar to now, would start around 9 in the morning and progress until 3 o'clock at night. Educating the rural population was becoming increasingly important, and with these new schools close to home, an education was possible for young children growing up in rural areas. Most students today take a bus to and from school, but there did not used to be a bus to ride. Many children walked on foot every day, even if the weather was bad. Some walked a mile, whereas others may have lived right next to the school. Students from Mossback would walk 3 miles to the Oakland school. That is, until the Mossback school was opened. Under super harsh conditions, such as thunderstorms, parents sometimes drove their children to school.
It was often more difficult then to drive places because many roads were made of dirt.
When it would get cold, the school would use a stove to heat the room. There would often be a wood-burning stove or potbelly stove in the classroom. There were, of course, bathrooms. However, most of the schools had them located outside.
There was one, and it was outside. Then at Bethel, I think the third year that I went there, then they had put in what they called, they were big tanks in the basement. And there was 2 bathrooms then.
One story passed down from the year 1941 told of a teacher who fell through the floor of an outhouse. Shortly after she fell into the pit, a student came out of the schoolhouse and heard her teacher calling for help. All of the children tried to pull her out, but had no luck in doing so. Some kids ran to the nearest farm and used a telephone to call for help. Using rope, the neighbors succeeded in pulling her out. After that, she remained in a hospital for a while with a rash from the contaminated water. Without the help of her students, she would have surely drowned. Also in rural schools, students usually had to bring their own lunch with them, but sometimes the school would make a hot lunch for everyone.
Some, if it was nice, some ate. And there was a hollow tree somewhere. A hollow tree, some would just sit on the lawn. Some would stay inside.
Nowadays, school buildings have hot lunch, bus transportation, heating, and some even have air conditioning. Conditions now in public schools are better than they once were. Children were often more active back then because of farm chores, walking to school, and recess.
Many exciting games were played during recess, such as hopscotch, hide and seek, and Red Rover.
When recess was over, the teacher would ring a bell.
I don't think we had a big bell at Logan, handshake one that she used to come out and ring for when we was out to recess. But at Logan we had big bell tower.
It is said that since teachers were the only adults present during the average school day, it was difficult to keep all the children in line and well behaved. In order to be a teacher back then, they had to be 17 years old and pass a test to get a teaching certificate. As time went on, more and more requirements had to be met. It was a difficult job teaching 8 grades in one's room all by oneself. Sometimes class would be held outside in the grass, which children as well as teachers enjoyed. They taught subjects similar to nowadays, like arithmetic, history, geography, reading, and penmanship. Teachers would use objects such as chalkboards to give lectures. While these lectures were occurring, the children would sit in desks and use ink for their studies.
We had individual desks that either the desk part, the chair was attached to the desk, and what you wrote on was actually a lid, and you lifted that up and you stored all your books and your pencils and your crayons and all of that inside of that, and you had to keep your desk neat. That was also a requirement. She did check that too. We couldn't have a whole bunch of just throw your stuff in there. We had to keep it organized, and it was a good learning experience.
Lockers were also not used. Instead, kids would use coat hooks to hang their belongings on. Many parents now, as well as then, believed school to be important for the future. Quite a few of them themselves did not possess an education, yet they thought it was a good idea for their children to get one. However, school did not always come first, considering that during certain times of the year, many boys would miss school for farm work.
Well, I don't know as was so much for girls. I think some of the boys stayed home, in the planting time and harvesting time. But I don't remember ever having to stay home, to work.
Children still got holidays off too, and they were often the same amount of days missed as now, but the summer break back then was longer. While school was in session every now and then, there may have been a fight or quarrel between 2 students. Arguing and fighting are inevitable with so many different personalities and ages under one roof.
Like there were 3 girls in my class. Sometimes there might be 2 gang up on one a little bit more than, but it didn't last long. And it didn't escalate into anything major.
Rural schoolhouses came to an end in Joe Daviess County around the late 1900s when larger school buildings were built and bus transportation started. Conditions and ways of teaching have changed dramatically from in the past. Nonetheless, rural schoolhouses created the path to education and formed the foundation to build off for future generations. Although the old rural schoolhouses came to an end for teaching children, some can still be seen amongst communities as reminders of the past.